to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain.
Welcome to Talking Supply Chain. I'm your host, Brian Strait. Cargo theft used to be something companies only worried about if they operated in certain regions or corridors, or maybe they hauled certain high-value products. But that's no longer the case in 2026. Many of you listening today may have heard about a $400,000 shipment of lobsters that were stolen out of Taunton, Massachusetts, en route to a Costco warehouse. That's just one of many recent high-profile cargo thefts that have made headlines and continue to concern the industry. I'm pleased to be joined today by a noted expert on cargo theft, Scott Cornell. I first met Scott years ago when he was at Travelers and I was covering cargo theft, and he's always been a bit ahead of the curve on the tactics that thieves are using. Today, he is the Vice President of Transportation Risk and Strategy at Logistic Insurance Solutions and also the current chair of the Transported Asset Protection Association, or TAPA Americas. Scott, it's great to connect with you again. Welcome to the show.
Ryan, thanks for having me. Great to reconnect and touch on this topic again and see what we can supply or share with the audience.
Yeah, great. I mean, I've always enjoyed talking to you over the years. I've always found you very insightful on the cargo theft and the current situation. So I'm excited to get into that today with you. We're going to cover a lot of ground in the time we have today.
Sure.
But before we get started, maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background, and maybe a little bit about what logistic actually is and what you guys do.
Yeah, so I have over 30 years experience in cargo theft investigations and supply chain security investigations. Been around the transportation industry since I was a kid. Literally my first job out of high school, I was driving truck, and then it turned out that I actually liked it and drove truck to help pay for my college, and then got into the cargo investigations early in my 20s and just kept going that way and found a career in there that I've really gotten to enjoy. I kind of been blessed with that. Moved over to Logistic Insurance Solutions recently after doing 25 years at my previous employer. And what we're really doing here is bridging the gap between insurance and operational security, meaning we're really working closely with our clients to teach them how to prevent cargo theft, what are the most recent strategies, what's going on in the industry, how to be prepared for it. And then, in the event that they do have a theft, we respond, we help them with their response, and hopefully we can get a recovery for them. I'll also add in there, you mentioned that I currently serve as the chairman for TAPA. TAPA is the largest transportation and supply chain security organization in the industry. We provide security standards for the industry. Members and members of the supply chain can get certified in those standards. We have multiple standards that relate to trucking security requirements, facility security requirements. We recently did the freight broker FPSR security requirements. I was privileged to lead a great build team with some of the top experts in the industry to build those, and those were very timely. We released those in July of 2025. And we have our national summit coming up in May. So
great. You mentioned you started driving trucks out of high school. My grandfather taught me to drive his truck when I was 14, which for insurance people out there, I know not the way it's supposed to be done.
Yeah, right.
But it was a very cool experience for a 14-year-old.
Well, I'll tell you, when I actually started in a warehouse, right? And then I was in the warehouse one day. I tell people this all the time. I was in the warehouse one day, and the warehouse manager walked up to me and he said, Cornell, driver didn't show up for work today, so you're a driver, don't hit anything. And gave me the keys to a giant box truck, and I was driving a giant box truck in the middle of winter in Buffalo, New York. And I managed not to hit anything, so...
Yeah, well, there you go. Different times back then. We don't advise anybody to start your people off today that way. But
exactly.
Although my grandfather was known for hitting bridges and things, he hit a number of them in his career. So
that's a different story.
That's a different story. But anyway, so we're going to get into cargo theft today.
Sure.
Let's kick off the conversation, kind of a broad look at what the landscape is today. I think years ago people looked at cargo theft, it was just kind of this nuisance thing that people kind of had, and maybe what the focus wasn't on it. that's kind of changed. So can you kind of characterize what the current state of cargo theft is compared to a few years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever?
Sure. I think one of the biggest changes, you mentioned that, the industry may have seen it at some point as a nuisance. And I think, if you narrow that down a little bit more, what was actually going on was most cargo theft at that time was targeted towards trucking, right? And it was mostly straight theft, what we call straight theft, which means they physically go out and steal it where it sits. And it was mostly targeted towards the trucking industry. And so a lot of the rest of the industry really didn't experience cargo theft the way we are seeing that today. So what's changed? It's foundationally changed. I mean, it really, since 2020, cargo theft in the United States is just fundamentally different. It's no longer these small regional crews that we used to see. And those crews were usually based out of, Florida, Georgia, California, the Chicago area, New York, New Jersey. And we knew them. They were small crews. Everybody who was an expert or who was investigating cargo theft knew what crews operated where, what they targeted, how they moved their stolen freight, things like that. We would pull video of them during the course of an investigation, and we'd see them and say, oh, that's so-and-so, that's this crew. And it was, more of a game of cat and mouse back then. But since 2020, we've seen cargo theft in the United States go international. So the majority of cargo theft in the United States now is being masterminded by large, sophisticated, very complex international crime rings that are operating out of 24 different countries across the globe. And it really, they really like to target strategic theft. Strategic theft is their method of choice. And that's a big change for the industry because it goes back to my first comment. Strategic theft involves everybody in the supply chain. So it's really targeted at the intermediary space, that freight broker space, which in reality was the part of the supply chain that was probably the least prepared and had run into or encountered the least amount of cargo theft prior to 2020. So now it targets those intermediaries, but it also involves the shipper, it involves the trucking industry. So big change and very confusing for the industry, and really kind of caught the industry off guard.
Yeah. So that last part, I mean, you talked fundamentally changed. Different areas of the supply chain now feel it. A lot of our listeners are supply chain folks, right? Who I think maybe going back to the initial part of that conversation, that answer, didn't know that much or didn't care that much about cargo theft, right? It was a trucking problem, right? So
Right.
what is, from your perspective, what are you seeing for the supply chain folks out there? What's the biggest misconception that they have right now about cargo theft? Is it that they still think that this is a trucking problem? Or is there something else that they face?
No, I don't think it's that they think this is a trucking problem. I think everybody understands the reality of it at this point. It's been going on for a few years, right? So if I tie in the last question with this one, cargo theft in the United States, according to CargoNet numbers, increased 93% roughly between 2021 and 2024. So all cargo theft, 93%, but strategic cargo theft surged 1,475%. So, that started in 2021 to 2022. Really, we saw the biggest part of the increase in 23 and 24. And so by now, as we sit here, everybody is of the understanding that this affects everybody. But I think the biggest misconceptions are that, let me say this, with strategic theft, one of the biggest issues is that we went from strategic theft being 3 to 5% of all cargo theft to roughly 30% of all cargo theft in a very short period of time. And in that same category, we went from roughly 2 methods of cargo theft to now 25 plus methods of cargo theft. And it really confuses the industry. So I think the misconceptions are, I see people out there when they're trying to figure out exactly how they're being hit, there's a misconception that a lot of this is good guys that are going bad. And that's not what's happening. I've seen comments out there about, it's really hard to predict when a good guy is going to go bad or make a decision to steal freight. We're just not seeing that. That's a misconception that I think is not common, but we're seeing it across the industry. And I think the other biggest misconception is that technology is going to fix this problem for me. If I just go out and buy the latest and greatest technology and implement that, that's going to solve this problem for me or protect me from this type of theft. And that's just not the case.
Yeah. We're going to get into technology in just a second, so it's a nice segue there. But before we do, I just want to ask you about the types of cargoes that you're seeing stolen these days. I think people always assume, right? I mean, I always did for years that it's electronics, it's high value stuff, right? Or it just simply is whatever is in the trailer at the truck stop that they can take, kind of thing. So, but with this kind of more strategic approach to theft that's taking place these days, are you seeing specific commodities that are being targeted right now?
Yeah, when I always kind of say this is like saying jumbo shrimp, right? But when all things are normal in cargo theft, food and beverage is going to be your number one targeted commodity. We saw that shift happen in 2010. So kind of coincidentally, every time there's a major economic issue, or in 2020 we had the pandemic that everybody dealt with, we will see some sort of a shift in cargo theft. And in 2010, because of the economic downturn for the 2 years prior to that, we saw the bad guys switch to food and beverage as the number one targeted commodity. Prior to that, it was electronics, as you mentioned. But by 2010, they had moved to food and beverage really out of necessity for economic reasons at that point. But we found out that they understood quickly that, hey, this is a great commodity for us. The evidence disappears. It's largely untraceable. There's no barcode on frozen chicken or meat, right? If the evidence isn't consumed, it spoils. It's easy to move. It's rather anonymous. You don't connect food and beverage to the internet like you do electronics, those types of things. So food and beverage, when all things are normal, will be your number one targeted commodity, followed by household goods, and then electronics actually comes in third. Now, one of the things I always say is cargo thieves are excellent at two things in particular. One, knowing what to steal and when to steal it, and two, return on investment. So if you go back to that what to steal and when to steal it, they will make a switch very quickly. So in 2020, when the pandemic hit, we went from food and beverage being number one to household goods being number one. Well, for obvious reasons, right? We were at home all day. Yeah. We were doing everything from home. So they'll make those pivots very quickly.
Yeah. Does inflation play a role in this in any way? I mean, we've seen a lot of inflation in all sorts of goods this year, but it sounds like maybe things haven't really changed as far as what people are targeting. But does inflation play a role in what? I mean, because that raises the price of a good. In theory, then I assume it raises the price of the resale of that good.
Yeah, I get asked that question frequently. I would say the economy doesn't have as much impact on what's being stolen as a lot of people would think. It's more so what's popular, what's in demand. And every year we see a commodity pop that is not something we expected, right? 2 years ago, it was solar panels. And when it happened, everybody was nodding their head saying, okay, solar is very popular. It's understandable. Last year it was metals, and it looks like metals is continuing into this year. And, the year before that, it was vacuums and refrigerators. Explain that one to me. I can't explain that one to you, right? So it's pretty consistent in what they target, but we do get these unusual pops on commodities every year, and we kind of wait to see what that's going to be year in and year out.
Yeah. So I want to revisit, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago about technology and technology coming into it. And I've kind of got three questions around this. One about criminals using it, one about companies using it. But to kick off the technology kind of component, can you just kind of talk about how technological advancement has changed the way that the cargo theft environment, the way we see it, the way organizations approach it these days? Because it's not just the companies that are using it, right? And the criminals are using it as well.
Absolutely. I having done this for over 30 years, I've watched the technology evolve on both sides, right? What we can offer for using technology to combat cargo theft, as well as what the thieves will use or adapt to try and get around us or get through everything that the supply chain is doing to block them. So, most recently, obviously, everybody's talking about advancements in AI. And we're seeing that. We're seeing the bad guys use AI, especially when you talk about these rings operating from foreign countries. We're seeing them use them to create mass emails and send out mass emails for phishing and social engineering attempts. That's become very popular over the last year. About a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, I was asked at a conference how often I was seeing email techniques such as the social engineering and the phishing. And my comment at that time was, we're seeing it, but we're not seeing it very frequently, maybe once or twice a month. As we fast forward to today, they're using AI every day to send out thousands of emails. And the technique there is such that, remember, they only have to get it right once. We as an industry have to block every single one of them, right? But they only have to get one email to be good enough for somebody to click on the link and give the information that they need so that they can infiltrate your email and things like that. We're also seeing intelligence that says that they're using AI to give a regional accent to a phone conversation. In other words, if they're calling somebody in the Northeast, they may use a New York accent. If they're calling somebody in the South, they may use a Southern accent, things like that through the use of AI. Now, I haven't been able to confirm that, but I've gotten that intelligence from some very good resources, and I believe it to be true, and it definitely wouldn't surprise me at all. So I think the level of sophistication that they're getting into with this is stunning. We also see them use technology, especially, again, AI, but other technology, to recreate documents, to clone documents, to make changes to existing documents that are used in the shipping process so that they can manipulate shipments. As an example, taking a bill of lading that's associated with a truckload, and let's say that truckload has 24 pallets on it, they may remove 22 pallets, leave 2 pallets in the trailer. They'll take that bill of lading and they'll use technology to manipulate it so that it now reads that it's a 2-pallet shipment, and they'll deliver those 2 pallets. So now the issue you get is it gets logged in at the consignee as a 2-pallet shipment because the paperwork matches. They see no issues or errors, and they don't realize until months later that that should have been 24 pallets.
Oh. Interesting. Using the creating the accent, I think that's interesting if that's taking place. Although I can tell you, as a kid who grew up with a Boston accent and the Boston New York rivalry, if you call me with a New York accent, I'm already skeptical of you. So,
well, and vice versa, right? If I'm in New
right?
York and you call me, I may be skeptical as well, right? As a former New Yorker, I have to defend my home state. So
that's a good example of how technology is being used by some of the criminals. Can we take it to the business side, right? The truckers, the shippers, the supply chain concept. How are they adopting technology, specifically maybe AI as digital tools, to help counteract what the criminals are doing on their end? Because there's always this give and take, right? And one side makes a change and then the other one reacts to that. So
yeah, I think, when I first started to be asked about the use of AI in cargo theft, my initial comment was, at some point it'll be AI versus AI, and I think we're in the beginning stages of that, right? You use AI as a bad guy to create a document. I'm going to use AI as a good guy to analyze that document, right? We see companies using AI to filter out calls, to analyze wording emails, to spot issues within emails when they try and make a slight change to an email address and things like that. So I think, it's still in its infancy as to how both parties are going to use this technology as it advances, but I think we're going to see that continue to grow. The other part of technology that we see the industry adopt is, really there's been a lot of, since the big surge in strategic cargo theft, there's been a lot of technology introduced into the supply chain to defend freight brokers against strategic cargo theft. There's platforms out there that are technology based, and some of them still have a human element, which I think really is the best. But there are a lot of platforms out there that are technology based that will help a freight broker vet a carrier. to make sure that you're not hiring a bad guy, or you're not hiring somebody who just recently purchased an MC number and is now operating that company under nefarious intent. So I think when you look at that, this goes back to, I think, one of the first questions you asked me, the misconceptions. That technology is not going to save you if you don't have good process and procedures around the use of it. When you look at the freight broker security requirements that we built at TAPA, it gives you a foundation of best practices across your entire vetting process. And you then insert some of this technology into those best practices to enhance the process. And I think that's really the best approach.
Yeah. So as we adopt the technology, right? I mean, there's a tendency for companies that put in new technology to rely on the technology. As we use technology to try to counteract cargo theft, are there gaps in what technology can do? Right? I mean, is it visibility? I mean, this is a big one, probably data sharing between partners. People don't like to share data.
Yeah,
is there things that we add to technology, and then there are areas that this technology is not going to address?
I think there's several, right? Visibility. So I think it goes back to your comment. Your comment was spot on. Companies don't necessarily like to share all data, and so there's still a little bit too much division in the supply chain when it comes to dovetailing together with use of technology or data or things like that. Now, there's been a lot of improvements in that. I will say, if you look at CargoNet as an example, the numbers that are reported to them have greatly increased over the last several years because the industry is more open to sharing the fact that they had a theft so that the industry can have better data and all that. But when you look at, visibility, a lot of companies don't even have the ability to have good visibility on their shipments. So you may not find out that your load is stolen for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. I've seen it even longer, right? And that's a huge gap. There is technology out there that can give you real-time visibility, and I definitely would encourage companies to use that type of technology, because after the first 24 to 48 hours, your chances at recovery drop by 45 or 50%, right? And then authentication. Carrier vetting systems are doing incredible work to ensure carriers are who they say they are. But we need better ways to verify that at the driver level. So is that person showing up at the dock the right person that's supposed to be picking up that freight? And I know, there's going to be some releases on some great technology for that here in the industry in the next couple of months, where a driver can be verified at the point of pickup to make sure, hey, this is the right person coming for the freight. Because when you look at that strategic theft category, the number one place where the theft takes place is at the point of pickup. And so that's the biggest gap right now, and that's the gap that has to be closed. Data sharing that you mentioned, and then I would say the last one would be, standardization, implementing different technology solutions with different expectations. I think, TAPA has worked to close this gap with our security standards, creating clear benchmarks for what proper security actually looks like across facilities and trucking operations and freight brokers. And technology is critical to that, but without standardization, or at least, a more consistent use of that technology within those types of process, everyone's building their own version of security, and then the criminals end up exploiting those inconsistencies.
Yeah, the visibility is, I mean, you mentioned that, and that's so interesting, so important. Not just the cargo theft, but in general. I mean, I had a conversation at an event with a fairly large manufacturer that was telling me that they kept having a problem with their shippers and just knowing when the shipments were going to show up.
Right.
And that wasn't a cargo theft problem. That was just simply a lack of willingness to share the data.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Brian. And there really needs to be that type of communication, right? And I understand, when there's a theft or there's concerns about what can be shared and things like that. But I can't encourage the supply chain enough that they have to start working together in this aspect. So to your point, shippers really have to open very good, clear lines of communication with the freight brokers that they're hiring, so that the freight brokers can have that communication down to the trucking companies that they're sending to pick up those loads. And when you talk about visibility, I'm dating myself here, but when the first tracking device came out in the industry, it was the size of a brick and it cost $3,000 and they were terrible, right? And now they're, you can fit them in a pill bottle, and some of them are even disposable, and you can get them for $50 to $75. I mean, there's really no good reason to not have that kind of visibility in today's environment.
Yeah. I want to kind of jump back a little bit to, you kind of touched on this topic earlier about how theft was changing to international rings and things like that. Years ago, theft took place where trucks stopped, right? I mean, I remember you telling me this story years ago when we first met,
Right.
of guys who would just wait outside a shipper or maybe a truck stop, and they just follow the truck down the road for 150 miles until it's far away, and then they'd stop the truck, wait for it to stop, and then jump in and take the stuff. But with technology these days, we're hearing more and more about these international theft rings.
Right.
Have we lost that kind of regional theft network that used to exist? Does that still exist? Or have we now shifted to more of these countrywide, big organizations, if you will?
Yeah,
it's theft big business, I guess. That's
Yeah, theft is definitely big business, right? So cargo theft is at all-time highs. I've never, in all my years of doing this, I've never seen cargo theft at the levels it's at. And one of the most common questions I get is, when will it go back to normal? And when they ask that, when they say normal, they mean pre-2020, right? And my answer to that is, you're in the new normal, right? It has plateaued. If you look at the CargoNet numbers, I think 2025 ended with reported 3,600 now. I always say CargoNet gets about 1/10 of all full truckload thefts, so multiply that by 10. And then, 2024 ended at, I think, 3,600, and 2025 ended at, I think, 20 thefts less, right? So it's plateaued, but it's plateaued at record levels. Now, going back to your question about regional theft, we're talking, we've had a lot of conversation this morning about the massive increase in strategic theft, that 1,475% surge. But keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, it went from 3 to 5% of all cargo theft to 30% of all cargo theft. So what's the other 70%? Well, the other 70% is what you and I have been talking about for years. It's straight theft. And I think that because of the massive increase in strategic theft and all the different methods that are confusing the industry and making everybody jump through hoops to try and prevent that in some cases we're losing sight of the fact that straight theft is still 70% of all cargo theft. So are those small regional crews still around? They absolutely are. But we also see those big international rings involved in straight theft as well. So we still see, big time targeting of freight physically, still at the truck stops, the drop lots, parking lots, you name it, things like that. I will tell you too, specifically pilferage, which is when they don't take the full truckload, but they take a pallet or 2 pallets off the back of a truck and disappear, has massively increased in that same time period for several reasons. One, the ELD mandate. The ELD mandate came out, and that basically placed a tracking device in the cab of the tractor. So at some point, and when you accompany that by those advancements we just talked about in covert tracking devices and things like that, those two things have made some cargo thieves say, well, I don't want to take the whole tractor and I don't want to take the whole trailer because I don't know if there's tracking in there. I don't want to have to hide the tractor and trailer, things like that. So I'm just going to get a box truck or a Sprinter van, and I'm going to open the rear doors and I'm going to take 2 pallets. And if you take that, Arizona-California border is probably one of the prime examples of that. Drivers coming out of California, they want to get to Arizona before they stop for fuel because fuel is cheaper. So the bad guys are now waiting just across the border in Arizona for the truckers to pull into the truck stops that are along the border there or along the parking areas that are along the border there so that they can pilfer a pallet or 2 or 3 out of the back of a truck. And when you look at the price of electronics today, if you pilfer a load of, tablets or computer monitors today, 2 pallets could be well over $100,000, approaching almost $200,000, depending on what the commodity is.
Yeah. We're not advocating a life of crime.
Right.
Listening.
Right. Yeah, definitely not.
But so I want to ask you a two-part question on this. As things have changed, as technology has evolved, does this make prosecution and load recovery harder for authorities? And are our law enforcement and regulatory agency partners, are they keeping up with the changes that are taking place in cargo theft these days?
It's a great question, and there's a couple of answers. The first thing I would say is yes, it makes recovery harder, not just for law enforcement, but for the industry as a whole, right? Prior to cargo theft in the U.S. going international, 6 or 7 or 8 out of every 10 loads stolen in the United States stayed in the United States. And I go back to my comments earlier about we knew those regional crews, we knew how they moved their freight, where they moved their freight, we knew where to go and look for it. These big international rings, 6 or 7 out of every 10 loads stolen now are moved out of the country. And so you have a much shorter window to try and find that freight and recover that freight. When you look at it from a law enforcement perspective and a prosecutorial perspective, you're going to have some similar difficulties there. I will say, though, if I use the CTIPS task force, the California Highway Patrol Task Force, as an example, honestly, right now, as we sit here today, there's no better task force in the country. And that's not a knock on any of the other task forces or units that are doing it, but that CTIPS task force is really dialed into what's going on in California, what's passing through California. And they've had some fantastic recoveries for law enforcement over the past year or two, helping the transportation industry recover goods. They've hit massive warehouses. But we've also had some, other successes across the country. In the Chicago area, law enforcement over there has had some really big recent warehouse busts and big recoveries for the industry. Right here in Arizona, Peoria PD had a great recovery about a year and a half ago, and they had never worked a cargo theft case before that. So I would say that there's a lot of effort being put forth on cargo theft by not only the task forces, but local and regional law enforcement when you can bring them good information, good intelligence, good evidence. Federally, we're seeing much more involvement over the past couple of years from both departments like HSI and the FBI. And I think some of that is in contemplation of this potential Corca bill that I think we're going to talk about coming forward. But we've definitely seen a recognition by the federal government that cargo theft is a much bigger problem than it has been. So we're seeing some really good cooperation from the FBI with the private sector and from Homeland Security to the private sector. And that cooperation, in all my years of doing investigations, cargo theft's not the only thing that I've investigated, but I will tell you that the cargo theft arena, unlike anything else I've ever seen, has the best cooperation between private sector professionals like myself or CargoNet professionals or heads of security at transportation companies and federal and local and regional and state law enforcement. There's just a great cooperation and partnership there.
So I want to jump ahead in a few minutes we have left to get a couple quick questions in on this. And that is for the supply chain professional out there. We've touched on a number of things throughout this conversation. Going back to the beginning that, it used to be a trucking problem. Now it's a supply chain problem. So you're a supply chain executive, kind of put your hat on for them these days, right? As we talk about sharing data, right, between partners, working with law enforcement, making sure that you're doing things that you can do, right, to try to limit theft and fraudulent, emails and things like that.
What
It sounds like is what we're talking about is really cargo security needs to be a culture, right? We need to build it as a culture. So can you offer some advice for the supply chain executives out there? Is that in order to do something like that, to build a cargo theft culture, or cargo theft security culture, I should say, is that hey, we need to just put in these procedures, these policies, these governance? Is it a training of the staff properly? Or are we talking something bigger, like shifting the mindset and the way you think about these external threats? Because shippers and supply chain people are all about risk mitigation these days. So I mean, this is exactly right up their alley, but I don't know that they approach it the same way that they approach, say, resilience of what happens if a supplier in another country goes down.
Right. Yeah, Brian, it's a great question. And I'm really glad you used the word culture, because I've been trying over the past year to use, any position that I've earned in this industry, or any voice that I've earned in this industry to use that exact terminology. The supply chain needs to develop a culture around supply chain security and cargo theft prevention, much like they did with safety, right? You and I both know decades ago, the supply chain really put a focus on safety as a whole. And when you talk to most companies, they will talk to you about the culture that they try and build internally around safety. And in general, we hear, industry organizations and everything like that talk about safety. That same culture needs to be developed for supply chain security. There needs to be an understanding. One of my best friends, Keith Lewis, always says cargo theft is a team sport, right? And that really does hit home in the sense that everybody has to play together on this. The shippers, the freight brokers, and the carriers have to be in lock sync, because what the bad guys do, I always equate the bad guys to water running down your roof. They're just looking for the first crack. And that's what they do. They look at the supply chain and they find the gaps. And right now, the biggest gap is that point of pickup when it comes to strategic theft. So there really needs to be a culture around this, and that culture encompasses almost everything that you mentioned. As an example, training. A lot of times what I find at companies, here at Logistic, I work very closely with a lot of our companies trying to teach them how to prevent cargo theft. And one of the things I find often is that I go to a company and the knowledge around cargo theft is concentrated within 2 or 3 people, sometimes one person, right? Where it really needs to be spread out across your frontline staff. When you talk about straight theft, there's no better line of defense that the industry has than the drivers. If you educate the drivers on, hey, this is what you're hauling and this is where you're hauling it, and these are the cargo theft issues along that way, please be on the lookout for these few things. Those drivers take that very personally. I find that drivers do not make good victims. They do not like to be stolen from. So if you give them that intelligence and then you supply them with the right tools, high security rear door locks, air cuff locks, landing gear locks, things like that, I find that the driver will be very engaged for the most part. When you talk about strategic theft, and I'm just trying to give 1 or 2 examples in each category, right? But when you talk about strategic theft, you have to train the entire team that's involved in booking the freight and booking and picking the carrier that's going to move the freight. You have to teach them what I call just basic red flags. You're not trying to make them all cargo theft experts. You're trying to develop sort of a spider sense within that team so that they see a red flag or 2 and they know enough then at that point to raise their hand to get a supervisor or to get the head of security or somebody who's more up to date or has more detailed knowledge around cargo theft to come and take a look at what they're seeing so that they can prevent that. And what I find when I go out and I spend that time with my clients and I help train their staff, almost instantly, Brian, within a week or 2, I'll get an email from that client saying, hey, we prevented this or we prevented that, or our team spotted this or spotted that. And you really turn it into that team sport mentality in-house, right? You really encourage that behavior, you reward that behavior when they find it. I tell my clients, maybe give somebody a $50 gift card to go to dinner when they stop a bad guy from stealing a $200,000 load. I think that's a great return on investment, right? So it is about culture completely.
So, you talked there at the end there about the internal process. I just want to ask you a question about the external process, right? Because when a load moves, there is a shipper, there might be a broker, a carrier, there's an insurance provider, maybe 2 of them, right? There may be technology providers, both for the carrier, for the broker. I mean, they've all have made different technology providers that are involved in this process. But I don't think any of this really works if all of those partners or participants aren't active partners, active participants in this process, right? So how do we get there?
I think communication is the key part, right? So if I'm a freight broker and I'm really trying to stop strategic theft, and I've gone out and let's say let's just paint a great picture here, Brian, as we talk about this, right? So let's say I'm a freight broker and I'm trying to prevent strategic theft, and I've gone out and I've taken the FBSR requirements from TAPA, and my company's gotten certified at one of the 3 levels in that. I'm going to take that information and then, let's say I've also engaged and went out and purchased some of the vetting technology that's out there and inserted that into that process. And so now I'm pretty confident that when I pick a carrier to move freight for Acme shippers that I'm picking a good carrier and they are not a thief. Right? But that's not where it ends, because cargo thieves can insert themselves into the transaction at any point. So at that point, as a freight broker, I need a good partner in my shipper where I can call that shipper and say, hey, I have picked ABC Trucking to move your freight. This is the driver's information. This is the carrier's information. Maybe there's a security code in there. I think I mentioned earlier, there's going to be some exciting technology coming out in the next month or two that will help verify a driver at the point of pickup, things like that. And so now I get my shipper to buy into that. What we don't want to see is, quite often when I get a call on a theft and I look at what the freight broker did, let's say they did everything right. They pick a good carrier and they pick ABC Trucking, and then it's XYZ Trucking that shows up at the shipper and they say, hey, we're here on behalf of ABC Trucking, and the shipper loads them, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be that type of a relationship of communication where the shipper says, well, I get what you're saying. I know you're saying you're here on a part of ABC Trucking, but I'm not releasing the freight to you until I talk to my freight broker. And there needs to be that open line of communication. There needs to be that cooperation. Or again, when that technology comes to the market soon, that we're excited about, hey, you're not, according to this technology, the person that's supposed to be picking up this freight. And then there needs to be good cooperation and communication there with back to that freight broker, right? Hey, this is who's showing up. We have a problem. And both parties need to have, at that moment, both parties need to have a process that they've pre-agreed on. Here's what we're going to do right now, right? Whether it's call law enforcement or, if it's a client of mine, call me or my team and we'll get involved and help you and things like that. I think that's what needs to take place as we go forward, that type of communication. If you don't have that type of communication, you have gaps, simply put.
Thank you, Scott. I want to get in, before we go, I want to get in one final question for listeners out there. And that is to ask you a piece of advice for them. There's a lot of supply chain leaders out there, and a lot of what supply chain leaders do is risk management, right? And risk mitigation. So there is risk and there's a reasonable amount of risk that they're willing to take. And I assume the cargo theft situation, same kind of thing, right? There is some level that, there's ROI they have to get, there's justification, and there's some level of risk that they're acceptable with. So what advice would you share with them to get a handle on their cargo and the risk that cargo faces from a theft perspective, to reach a level that's a risk tolerance level that's acceptable to their organization?
Yeah, I think the answer may sound very simplistic, but I can't stress it enough, is slow down just a little bit. I understand, I get this all the time. Hey, we're trying to move freight as fast and as efficiently as we can. And usually I get that comment when somebody's calling me about a theft. And my answer is usually, well, how fast are you moving right now? Right? When you have that theft, everything grinds to a halt. Everything slows down whether you want it or not. And then it has a bigger ripple effect. Are you going to lose a client? Are you going to lose a contract? Are you going to have insurance for this? Did you get the right insurance for this? Who's going to help you with all this? What's the internal cost to all this? So slow down just a little bit. Again, myself and several experts, a lot of times we talk and we look at a theft and we see that it's very preventable. Do the basics. Make sure you're slowing down just enough to do the basics. I'm not asking you to slow down to a point where, it's sloth speed. I understand the supply chain has to move fast, but simply put, sometimes I've seen where a simple Google search of an address or a company name, or actually going out and finding and verifying that the website for the trucking company has the same contact information as the trucking company that the bad guys are pretending to be in your vetting process. And that we're talking about a matter of additional seconds in a vetting process. So it sounds simplistic, but slow down just a little bit. Take your time well enough that you know who you're doing business with. In today's day and age, You absolutely, positively must know who you're doing business with is who you think they are.
Yep. Good advice. Great advice. It's so, again, like we mentioned, it's simplistic in many ways, but it's the advice that you get no matter what problem you're trying to deal with, right? It's like start with the basics
Right.
and do that. Don't skip on that. Yeah.
Can I add one thing, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that I would say is a lot of times when I speak in front of a room or at a conference, one of the last things I'll do is I'll say, hey, anybody in this room who, if you got a call right now that you had a cargo theft, that your company was experiencing a cargo theft, how many of you in this room have a plan in place at your company such that everybody at your company knows exactly what they're supposed to do when you have a theft? And I can be in a room, Brian, with 250 people and 4 people will raise their hand. You absolutely must have a plan. I will say it over and over again. If you have a cargo theft and you don't have a plan in place on how you're going to react when you have that cargo theft, that's like being a football coach showing up on game night and drawing plays in the dirt before your offense goes out on the field. It's not going to be pretty.
Yep. Yep. And that is true. Yep. Absolutely. Thank you, Scott, so much for your time today.
Thanks for
Greatly
having me.
appreciate it. And obviously people listen out there, don't follow some of our advice. Don't start driving trucks at 14.
Right. Right.
Don't be taking pallets off trailers that are not yours.
That's right. Yeah.
But a lot of good advice in the conversation today on how to try to mitigate some of the risk that you face with your cargo. So
I
thank
enjoyed
you.
being here with you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Great. We're out of time. I want to thank my guest today, Scott Cornell, Vice President of Transportation Risk and Strategy at Logistic Insurance Solutions and TAPA Americas, and all of you who took time out of your day to listen to us today. We greatly appreciate it. New episodes of Talking Supply Chain come on Thursdays. You can find them on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain.
Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.